Okay, we're back again. So here we're going to be covering Module 8, Part 2. We're still on speciation and extinction. Bear with me. I know the past two YouTube videos have differed in resolution and widescreen, standard screen, standard definition. I'm still trying to figure out some of my settings. So hopefully at this point in time I figured them out. But just bear with me until I can get it 100%. So I just wanted to let you all know that's why there's some different aspect ratios happening, as I'm still just tinkering around with the technology on my end. So it's not you, it's me. Okay, so make sure you guys are going to make sure you're doing your reading, pages 128 to 145. Remember, the quiz itself is open book, so you'll be able to use your book. So if you read in advance, you won't be, shuffling around and trying to find the answer. Okay, so you should have already turned in your Hardy-Weinberg lab yesterday, and you should have also already taken your Module 7 quiz, which was also open book. So if you haven't turned that Hardy-Weinberg lab in, turn it into me anyway. You'll lose a few points just for it being late, but it's better late than never. So get that turned into me, and I will give you the points that you have earned. Okay, so this week's reminders. So everything that we're covering this week, it's going to be on the Module 8 quiz. So that's going to be on Tuesday, April 7th. So just we're prepping for that. So make sure you're doing your readings. Make sure you're watching these lectures. I know you could just put it on your phone when you're washing dishes or whatever you're doing, and you can listen to me talk around in the background. So also this week we covered Lab 8 yesterday, and that was our island biogeography. So make sure you're filling that out. That's also due Tuesday, April 7th, and I've corrected on my PowerPoint presentation here that the Bio News File number 3 is due on Tuesday, April 7th, not Friday, April 7th. It's a Tuesday. I'm sorry I had a typo on my PowerPoint in Monday's lecture. That was my fault. I'm still just trying to scramble and get everything uh, collected so that everything runs smoothly from here on out. So. Okay, so today in our Module 8, we are going to be covering spatial patterns and also more speciation. So I know we already covered a little bit on speciation in some of the past modules, so some of this might be a little bit of review for you guys, but the majority of it is relatively new, so bear with me. If there's some refreshers, that's fine. It'll be good for you, especially if you remember it for when you're taking the quiz on Tuesday. Okay, so I want you guys to remember back to when we did talk to speciation. So speciation, in a nutshell, is the formation of a new species. So the divergence of an ancestral species into two or more new species from that ancestral species. Okay, so when this new species is formed, basically individuals in a population are becoming reproductively isolated from the rest of the population. And what that basically means is that certain members of a population are not going to be breeding with the members of the population from which it came or the population from which it separated from. So reproductively, these two groups themselves are not going to be breeding or going back and forth to the populations typically. And eventually they become so different depending on where they live, what their habitat is, what their environment is, that they're going to eventually become a fully separate species in themselves. So we know that there are several different types of barriers, and we talked about that on Monday, our prezygotic and our postzygotic barriers, and all the different types of isolation. And we know that these reproductive barriers can keep species apart from each other, keep species separate. But how does that happen? So we're going to get into that. My little snail image here talks a little bit about geographic isolation and filling different niches. So that is our speciation. Depending on what sort of geographic barrier we have here, or what sort of mountain range or ocean or island. So that's one of the ways that species are separate from each other. Okay, so we know that our speciation is going to be occurring in areas that have geographic separation, because we know that certain things that exist in the environment, like our mountains, our oceans, canyons, various other environmental, geographical, or geological structures that have occurred on Earth's surface, keeps those species apart. But we also know that in areas where species have direct contact with each other, speciation can also occur. So in my image here, you see obviously we have a grove of pine trees, and there is some sort of rift in the Earth's surface. You have some sort of earthquake or something, and eventually those two species, the species of tree that is on either side of that land formation of that earthquake here, or of that ravine, they're not going to have any contact with each other. So eventually they're going to become their own species. Now on the lower image here, you can see the same grove of pine trees, and over time there is a formation of a new species, and all of those species have contact with each other at all times. So they're all growing in the same land mass. There has been no geographic event that has occurred, and basically that is just occurring amongst all the other species. So the two different types of our spatial patterns that we're going to be talking about today is our allopatric speciation and our sympatric speciation. And I think I have maybe mentioned these two terminology before. So we're gonna talk a little bit about it. So remember the tree image I showed just on the last slide about the no contact and the constant contact. Now we've put terms to those specific events that are happening here. So our allopatric speciation is going to be happening when there's some sort of geologic or geographical separation, and our sympatric speciation is going to be occurring when there is our constant contact. Okay, so our allopatric speciation that we have here, what's going to be happening is we're going to be having a new species that forms when this geographic barrier is physically going to separate a population into two new groups that cannot interbreed. So in this example here, I have the Grand Canyon. And in the Grand Canyon, there's lots of different species of chipmunk and squirrel populations. But likely what has happened is when the Grand Canyon was formed, there was a population of chipmunk and a population of squirrel. And eventually the chipmunk species and the squirrel species ended up, there was populations on either side of the canyon. They typically don't crawl down deep into the canyon, so they're separated by this giant rift, this very deep gorge. And so eventually over time they have become very different. And so now this population that was maybe once one has now become two species that's separated by this canyon. So we have the chipmunk species and the squirrel species that exists on the south rim. That is very different than the chipmunk species and the squirrel species that exists on the north rim. Now those two chipmunk species, they don't meet, they don't breed, and even if they were together, it's likely that they wouldn't breed. And then also the squirrel species, they look a little bit more different than the two chipmunk species if you compare them. They're not breeding with each other, they're two separate populations. And so that is our allopatric speciation that's happening because there is that physical barrier. And you see this happening also a lot. This was happening when we talked about Darwin's Galapagos tortoises. So when we had those 3 different species of tortoise, they were living on 3 different islands. They were separated by oceans. They all lived on a different island. And so eventually, over time, they developed different traits and characteristics and changed so that they were no longer part of the ancestral population, and speciation occurred, and so those species of tortoises became their own species. Okay, so one important thing to note about allopatric speciation is that is the reason that populations evolve differently. So after a separation were to occur, say there's some sort of earthquake or volcanic explosion of some sort that's separating a population into 2 species, they're evolving for 2 different reasons. So the first one is maybe different mutations that are occurring in one of the populations is not being shared with the other population. And so for example, one of the squirrel species in the Grand Canyon example we just looked at had a mutation that made its tail more white on one of the sides of the rim, and then eventually over time it genetically changed that squirrel just so, whereas now genetically it has a different makeup than the squirrel on the other side of the canyon. Okay, and then also when we talk about selective pressures, which is something we've talked about a few different times, when we have selective pressures occurring in the environment, it's changing whatever population of species that's living there to become better suited for that particular habitat. So if you remember, we talked a lot about rabbits in the past. So in my example here, we have another rabbit example. And so out in the desert, in the Mojave, there are a few different types of rabbit. And so depending on the separation, the geographical separation for the Mojave Desert versus another desert that exists, say maybe like the San Joaquin Valley in California. So these 2 desert types will have 2 different types of rabbit. Maybe they were one population at one point, but say in the San Joaquin Valley, there's a lot more birds of prey, maybe condors or whatever. And so the rabbits have evolved and diverged to better blend in with their habitat. So that is one of the selective pressures that's driving that speciation to happen in that area, whereas the Mojave Desert perhaps has a different type of predator, maybe a fox or a coyote. And so the rabbits that have diverged there don't necessarily blend into the background to hide from birds of prey because they don't need to. Instead, they need to be very quick and fast. And so the rabbits might be a little bit larger. They might be less likely to be camouflaged, but they have maybe longer legs that are stronger that allow them to move a lot faster. And so those different selective pressures in different environments are changing those species to best adapt to their surroundings. Okay, so we talked about allopatric speciation, so now let's talk a little bit about sympatric speciation. And so our sympatric speciation is happening when a new species arises in an area that is the same area as an ancestral species. So you have a new species that's forming in the same area. There's no geographical barrier here. And so in this example here, we have little mice as in our photo here. And so this divergence of these species is happening despite any sort of geographic isolation. So we have our little white mice here, that's our original population, our ancestral population. We have some sort of ecological isolation happening. So even though it's the same area, say perhaps that maybe there are larger trees growing in a grove there in that photo in letter B. And so some mice like to hide in the trees, or the other mice like to possibly hide in the grasses, but it's all just one big area. And over time, reproductive isolation is starting to happen. And so the mice that live in the area with the larger trees are maybe becoming larger or more red to better hide inside of the trees or around the tree base of the trees, where the white mice that live in the grasses are not changing that much. And over time, we have the genetic divergence and then that reproductive isolation. And so we have these mice that are changing even though they live in the same area, but they're just adapting a little bit differently to the resources that are in that environment. So our sympatric speciation, we just mentioned, does not involve a physical or a geographic border or a barrier. So there's no barrier there. It's all occurring in the same habitat. And you see sympatric speciation happening a lot when there is differences that aren't necessarily large physical differences that are happening. So sometimes you'll see these differences that occur in a behavior. So for example, maybe a bird will have different mating rituals. Perhaps they'll have different songs. Maybe they'll display a little bit different. They'll do a weird little dance or some sort of ritual. Maybe they'll bring sticks or twigs to their mate, and whoever can bring the prettiest stick or whatever will then win the breeding rights for the female. So you'll have these behavioral differences, and then also you'll have something like timing of mating or the biology of the individual species. So you'll have, for example, here on the far left side, you can see I have two different types of flies. I have the apple flies and the hawthorn flies. And they're very similar. I can't even see a difference when I look at them. But the difference here is the timing of the mating. So it has a different behavior style. So the apple fly is emerging from its egg sac and mating around the month of July. So that is when the apple fly emerges and mates. Now the hawthorn fly is emerging from its egg sac and mating in August. So unfortunately, these two different species have just missed each other. So the apple fly will already be done mating and have laid its eggs by the time the hawthorn fly has emerged and is ready to start mating. And so these behavioral differences makes them a completely different species. So this is a type of speciation that's happening that does not involve a physical barrier. This is more of a behavioral difference or a biological difference for these two distinct fly species. And then eventually the larva develops, and then there's a resting stage that occurs before the eggs will hatch, and then the mating will occur for the next generation. And so here's just one of the examples. You can see how sympatric speciation is happening and why it's a little bit different than the allopatric speciations. There's no physical barrier that's preventing these two species from becoming different. It's a biological thing. So one other thing that we see commonly with sympatric speciation is polyploidy. So we talked just a little bit about polyploidy back in maybe module 3 or 4 with plants when we were talking about DNA. So polyploidy is basically a mechanism that occurs for sympatric speciation in plants. And what's happening here is plants basically have their number of sets of chromosomes increase. So sometimes you see plants that have duplicate sets of chromosomes, and this is how speciation occurs a lot of times in plants. And so in this particular example, we have two different wheat species with a with their when they breed, then they create a sterile hybrid, and that sterile hybrid has a number of chromosomes that fall somewhere between the two species that were interbreeding. And so this hybrid is a mix between the tall, skinny wild wheat and the short, fat wild wheat, and it has that chromosome number right in between. And then a lot of times we see the plants that have the duplicate sets of chromosomes. So this is what happens here. So now that doubling of a chromosome number happens, and then we have, instead of 21, we have our 42, and this is what gives us a lot of different types of plants that we use today. This gives us our bread wheat, different types of sugar, different types of potato starches, and things that we use and eat today. And so this is how plants have sympatric speciation happening. It's this polyploidy occurrence that's happening in their chromosomes. So when we talk about spatial patterns, determining when a species is experiencing allopatric or sympatric speciation can sometimes be difficult for a number of reasons. And it's because it can be somewhat controversial. So when we talk about these two different types of speciation that's happening, scientists argue on which one is occurring because these two definitions of the geographical barrier or the basically the non-geographical barrier, or the barrier that's happening in the population geographically here. Basically, these two different definitions represent different points along a continuum. So it could have been a geographical distinction that happened originally, and then maybe sympatric speciation happened after that, or vice versa. But they do fall along a continuum, and so it can be debatable on which one could have happened first. The second reason why scientists have a hard time determining which type of speciation it is because we might not be able to detect specific barriers. Now, if we have a barrier like a highway or a freeway or a mountain range or a large body of water, that's a little bit more straightforward, but there are some barriers that we might not be able to detect. Perhaps it's some sort of flyway that's happening. So when there's a different swirling of air that's happening above, for birds, there could be a flyway that separates two different types of species. Maybe one species uses one particular flyway and one species uses another, or something like that. Something that we can't particularly detect, or something that we don't know is causing the barrier. And then there's also debate over the size of the geographic barrier that is needed to separate the two populations. So when we think about it, we think, yeah, a mountain range is like a big barrier, right? But for maybe a fruit fly or a very small fly species, the top of a tree to the bottom of the tree is a very large barrier for them. And so even though it's maybe, 30, 40 feet high, depends on the size of the organism you're talking about. Maybe for some sort of insect, that seems like a really large barrier if there's a species of fly that lives at the top of the tree and a species of fly that lives at the bottom of the tree, or something along those lines. And so, we're not sure what constitutes as a significant barrier. It really depends, I think, on the situation. And so this is why scientists argue about this particular topic as well. So sometimes, since it is somewhat difficult to determine, if it's an allopatric speciation or a sympatric speciation, and why it's so debatable, what is a geographical barrier that's, significant, we have what we call ring species that develop. And so basically what a ring species is this is a situation when you have two populations that don't interbreed and they're living in the same region, and they're connected by a ring of a geographic ring of populations that can interbreed. And so I'm going to go through two examples here of a seagull species and a California salamander species. But basically, what's happening is a species starts somewhere, and then as it moves around, maybe like a lake or a mountain range, the species are very similar, and those species that are connected can breed with each other. And then once it reaches the starting point, then the species has become so different that even though the starting species and the ending species are right next to each other, they can't interbreed because they have become so different over time as the species has migrated around a specific geographic element. So that's why we call it a ring. It kind of makes a ring around a lake or a mountain or whatever we're talking about. And so we'll look at a few examples here. So in this particular example, we have a seagull species. So there's a few different seagulls here that are existing over around the North Pole. And there's all different types of gull you can see here. I've listed a few of them. There's the American herring gull, which is the very large seagull that we typically see a lot around our beaches. There's the Vega herring gull, Brula's gull. We see the lesser black-backed gull, the regular herring gull, the Siberian black-backed gull. A lot of different species of gull here. So basically what's happening is within the ring, there are neighboring birds that can mate with each other if they're right next to each other, and they look, even though they look a little bit different, they can mate. But the birds at the very end of the ring, the two species at the very end of the ring here, the herring gull and the lesser black-backed gull, they have become so different and distinct that they can't mate with each other, even though they basically are living side by side. So these ring species here are some of the best evidence that we have for how new species evolve. So they're migrating around that circle or around that ring and changing over time, but they're not so different that they can't breed until they get back to the starting point where then they have become so different that they can't breed. And we see this also in salamanders. So this is our San Joaquin Valley here. It's a desert in the center of California. And we have a couple different species of salamander that have formed a ring around the desert here. They basically are living in a mesic forested environment in California, but they've created that ring around the Central Valley for the same reasons that the gull has. They're separated by that San Joaquin Valley in Central California. So over time, you know, they've moved around this desert area in California, and some of the species are very similar. As long as they're right next to each other, they can still interbreed, or some of them can, but the species that are at the ending point and at the starting point have just become so different where they don't interbreed. And it's kind of cool to see it in salamanders too, because they can't fly like the bird species can. And so when you see something like that happen, then you know this has probably happened very gradually over many, many years. And this is just showing you that this is how we can trace evolution. So ring species really help us trace how evolution happens over time. It can give us a better idea of how the populations are moving, which direction they're moving around a specific geographic barrier. So in this green warbler example, you see the Tibetan Plateau. You have the initial ancestral species here in blue. The ring has moved all the way around the Tibetan Plateau, and eventually the red area here in this figure has become so different than the blue area, they don't interbreed. Okay, so we talked a little bit about how ring species can help us track evolution, but how fast does evolution occur? So what is the pace? Like, how does it actually occur? So this is in your book in section 14.4, where it talks a little bit about how speciation is happening. Is it gradual? Does it happen instantaneously? What's going on? So there are two theories on how evolution is occurring, like what the pace is. And so the first one is our gradualism, and the second one is our punctuated equilibrium. So when we talk about gradualism, it's very similar to what it sounds like. So it is the slow, methodical, gradual changes in species. So punctuated equilibrium, however, is a little bit different. It's almost like a stop, start, and go, and there's events that have happened that have changed the species significantly in certain points in evolutionary history. So here's a couple other figures for our gradualism. So it's happening in small incremental changes, not chances. This was essentially what Darwin's idea was when he talked about evolution and his principles and his theory. He hypothesized that this was happening slowly and changing over millions of years, very slowly and steadily. So you can see in my image here are katydids, or our leaf bugs or leafcutter bugs. They have an ancestral leafcutter bug, and over time its speciation has happened. There's some sort of divergence in populations, and it's happening very slowly, and they're changing very slowly over time. The same thing in the image here with our bird, our little orange bird. Over time, that population, that ancestral population, is diverging, and it's having now two morphological differences. We have the yellow version and the red version of this particular bird, and it's happened very slowly over time. You can see the orange was slowly and gradually changing from yellow or to red over time, and this typically happens over millions of years. It doesn't happen very quickly. Okay, so the second topic for talking about pace of evolution is our punctuated equilibrium. So our punctuated equilibrium is showing us how species or characteristics on species can evolve at different rates. And so when something happens along a species timeline, this is when our punctuated equilibrium is happening. So, for example, we have a species, maybe that orange bird again. You can see in the figure above me here. This orange bird is orange for a while. It's experiencing that period of stasis or staying the same. And then all of a sudden something happens in the evolutionary timeline. And all of a sudden, very quickly, the bird changes from orange to yellow. Perhaps this is a mutation. Maybe this is some sort of pressure or genetic shift of some sort. And so then all of a sudden it goes from orange to yellow. So we still have the orange species, but we also have a divergence into that yellow species almost instantaneously, or very close in evolutionary terms. And then after time continues on, we have it happen again. But in this time, instead of that orange bird, even though that orange bird still exists, it's turning red all of a sudden instead of yellow. However, that orange bird still exists, even though that yellow version and that red version are still there. But something happened somewhere in that evolutionary timeline that triggered that coloration change. And this is just an example. It could be anything. It could be any characteristic. It could be the bill shape. It could be what the style of wings. It could be perhaps some sort of vertebra or skeletal structure that's happening. Now, typically, you'll see these punctuated equilibrium events happen after some sort of extinction. Perhaps a mass extinction, or you'll see it happen after the extinction of dinosaurs and the evolution of mammals. So you'll see maybe a meteor hit the earth and maybe stopped a certain characteristic from being developed, and then after that, that species only looked a certain way, and then maybe something happened again where there was some sort of food shortage or some event that happens that's creating this stop start of morphological differences in when it comes to evolution here. Okay, and so I believe this is my last slide for today. So the last thing I want to talk about is our adaptive radiation. And so you may have seen, I think I showed the adaptive radiation wheel here before when it came to birds, but I just want to talk a little bit about it because it is in your book and you should know it for the quiz. But our adaptive radiation is basically this diverse array of characteristics of a particular taxonomic group that is the result of rapid speciation that's happening. So all of these species that are forming from a single ancestral line. So for example, when it came down to Darwin's finches, you have a single ancestral founder species of a bird here. Now when those islands got all separated, and formed their island chain in the Galapagos, there was a lot of niches to fill, so you had a lot of rapid species formation to fill niches. Maybe you have the nectar and insect eater or the honey creepers. You have different insects only, maybe insect seeds and eggs, maybe only nectar. So depending on what sort of environmental characteristics that bird was best suited for, you have all of these species radiating out almost as if a wheel. So you'll have that ancestral species that has created all of these other species. So it's not just a two linear divergence. It's almost like a wheel of speciation that's happening. And you see this happen to a lot of times in Africa as well. So in fish species in freshwater lakes in Africa, you have a cichlid species. Maybe that was an ancestral species. And you have this divergence or this adaptive radiation of many species that are being formed from this single ancestral species. And so that's why you see so many cichlids out in lakes in Africa, because they have had adaptive radiation happen and created all of these different fish species that fill all of these different niches. So, okay, so that is all I have for part 2 in module 8 of our speciation and extinction. So please join me for our last part. I should have a video coming out very shortly, and we're going to be talking a little bit about extinctions in our next part of our lecture series. So thanks. Any questions, feel free to email me and let me know.